verifiable credentials as the shipping containers of data. I really like this analogy because the beauty of verifiable credentials is it's a data model innovation. So if we do our jobs right, you're not seeing or experiencing filling out digital forms.
Hello and welcome to the Next Level Supply Chain with GS1 US, a podcast in which we explore the mind-bending world of global supply chain, covering topics such as automation, innovation, unique identity, and more. I'm your co-host, Reed.
And I'm Liz.
And welcome to the show. Okay, Liz, I know we're about to hit your sweet spot today with decentralized identification, cryptographically verifiable information, verifiable credentials. Isn't this your sweet spot, Liz?
Yeah, this is my foreign language. This is going to be great learning for me today.
The good news is we have an expert, and it is our pleasure to bring to the show Carol Fowler, who's the CEO and co-founder of Transmute. Carol, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, Carol, when we talk about, verifiable credentials and decentralized identifications, and it starts to get into an alphabet soup real fast. But before we jump into this, and I know that this is truly your sweet spot and what Transmute does and what you've been working on for many years now, just tell us a little bit more about yourself and Transmute as a company and what you do, just for the audience.
Awesome. Yeah, certainly. So Transmute is a technology company headquartered in Austin, Texas. We have a growing team that spans North America with a small footprint in Europe as well, too. And what we do is we use these emerging identity and credentialing technologies that you mentioned to fortify global supply chains with digital trust. I come from the semiconductor and bioelectronics industry, which seems really far away from software when you think about it at first. However, these are two supply chains when it comes to medical devices or semiconductor, microchips that are really complicated, highly regulated supply chains. And so I was able to get a really upfront, close and personal view of some of what I think of as black box gaps in those really highly regulated supply chains. And sometimes it's not even just that it's highly regulated. In the case of many medical devices, no one foundry or facility can build the full device. And this is also true for some of the more advanced chip technologies that we have. And these are industries where it's incredibly cost prohibitive to insert new kinds of machinery or tools to produce identification down to, the nanoscale or the chip level and the component parts. And so the industries in many cases have been historically resistant to making some of those investments. However, we now live in a globalized, fully digitized world where we have to rely in many cases on less than trusted trading partners. And so how do we insert that trust without disrupting efficiency or resiliency? And how do we limit the cost for that? And so bringing it back to Transmute, what we do is we use decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials to insert that trust into the supply chain. And we do that specifically by actually digitizing various pieces of documentation that currently exist largely in paper, as you guys definitely know at GS1 today in the supply chain. So our first markets have been focused on going to market in steel imports into the United States and more recently e-commerce imports into the United States, although we do have some work that spans back to the chip industry as well.
And when you say, this digitized verification, we're talking blockchain, are we not?
So no, actually. Yep, you do. Questions? Yes, you do not need a blockchain. Blockchain, for better or worse, has been created a lot of buzz and a lot of noise over the last few years, and has certainly helped, I would say, usher in this new ways of thinking about how we apply cryptography. But at the end of the day, you don't need a blockchain to provide cryptographic evidence that someone claimed something at a certain moment in time about a certain product at a certain point, certain place in the world. And you can provide ironclad proof of that by using verifiable credentials. So it might be helpful right now to just kind of explain those two technologies. So decentralized identifiers, the way I like to think of them is they are a unique digital fingerprint that can be assigned to anything, a person, an organization, or even an asset or concept. And these identifiers can persist across different kinds of systems. They include a public-private key pair, so whoever holds those keys owns that data. This is in line with that kind of blockchain initially inspired thinking around what you hear of self-sovereign identity. But at the end of the day, businesses also have identity. They have IP, they have trading routes and partners, and they have reason to need that enhanced portability, privacy, and security. When you sign claims about of data with a decentralized identifier, it becomes a verifiable credential. And I'm actually going to appeal to a gentleman in our industry, a colleague, Timothy Ruff, who wrote a really awesome blog post around verifiable credentials as the shipping containers of data. I really like this analogy because the beauty of verifiable credentials is it's a data model innovation. So if we do our jobs right, you're not seeing or experiencing filling out digital forms a whole lot differently, maybe. However, on the back end, what's happening is if it's in a verifiable data format, you've now, it's built on a standard that allows that data, again, to persist and travel across different contexts without losing any sort of context and without losing the integrity of who made those claims. And this is really important, of course, in supply chain, which I know we'll talk a lot more about.
Yeah, no, that is really helpful for all of us to start to visualize this. I love that analogy of the shipping container is the verifiable credential. It's the information, it's the product that's inside of it. That is very cool. Liz, I know you had a question you wanted to.
Yeah. Well, and the shipping container analogy actually, it helps me because I don't live in this data world like you all do. Taking it back to more my world, and a question for you. You said that one of the things that you're working with are these imports. So steel imports, e-commerce imports. We've been hearing a ton in the news, maybe less so right this second, but we know that supply chain, there's a lot going on. We hear a lot about that domestically. From an import perspective, from an international perspective, are there unique challenges there that you can share a little bit about that you've seen?
Absolutely. So here I'll use the steel use case because it's the one we can talk most publicly about, and I think is one of the more accessible use cases, believe it or not. But Transmute has been working under the Department of Homeland Security Silicon Valley Innovation Program with US CBP. They funded ourselves and several other really awesome companies to apply these two technologies to various commodities. And ours, as I mentioned, started with steel. And so I'll speak from the US and kind of North American perspective for a second. This is a commodity that internationally is still heavily traded using paper. And in fact, there's a document, the first credential that we modeled into the verifiable credential data format is called the mill test report. In steel, when you're importing into the United States or into North America generally, the mill test report helps you determine the chemical and mechanical properties of steel. You need to know with certainty that it is the grade and quality that you purchase, but you also need to know the origin. And today, legally, the mill test report represents the origin because this is the first place where the raw scrap or ore was melted and transformed. And so because this document is on paper, we have a situation where we're in a really reactive position. And what I mean by that is today, if, say, some raw steel is flagged at a port of entry, maybe in Houston, it could take on average 32 days for the US government, if they want to take a closer look or investigate, to track down these paper documents to even begin the investigation. So that means it's costing someone, usually multiple stakeholders, a lot of money for the steel to either be idle or worse, be allowed through the port and into our infrastructure or consumer goods. Obviously, this holds a big national security burden as well. However, there's lots of good actors who want their steel shipped expediently through the ports as well, and are often subject to timelines like I just mentioned. And so in a world where you have verifiable credentials being used instead of paper, the US government and any other supply chain actor involved in importing that steel can be privy to that information digitally, pre-arrival. As soon as each of the documents required are issued, they can be transmitted. In addition to that, because it comes with the cryptographic proof, you know with certainty whether or not that information has been tampered with. And I'm going to add one more layer of complexity, which is at Transmute, and in our work with US Customs, they've mandated the use of these open standards I'm talking about, but they've also requested the use of something called linked data. And this is where I think the future of supply chain gets way more interesting because, of course, like you guys at GS1 know, none of these paper documents or product identifiers are issued all at once. You know, a broker doesn't, they have to wait for this information to be aggregated and collected, which is part of why we're in that reactive position. So if there's an opportunity to issue data early and ensure that it's still all linked together in the full package, now you have a situation where there's much higher facilitation throughput, and you can enable much more precise enforcement activities. Historically, things like trade facilitation and enforcement have been in conflict. And as a native Texan, being very aware of some of the recent headlines, I think we saw that most recently when, for instance, our governor was stopping trucks for enforcement reasons. That is a classic example of how that manual nature of enforcement hindered facilitation. And so for the first time in history, as Vinny, our customer at CBP, likes to say, we have the technological means to positively impact both of those activities. But the only way we can do that is using these open standard-based data formats.
Wow, you just unpacked so much there in just one question as we're going through this. I mean, I've been a part of this where you're waiting for a product at the port and you need it to get through. Steel is one example. Semiconductors is another example. Health products that need to get through. Food that can go bad. As we've all seen, we held it a little bit longer because it didn't have the right documentation and now it's going bad. So it's been wasted. There's a lot of aspects of that. I believe that some of what you just told us, though, you also did a proof of concept with GS1 US around this. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, we did. So it was a really exciting proof of concept. And I'll say that at Transmute, we are the technologists. So we started in the technology standards. That's where we met the folks we work with at the government, and that's also where we met GS1. So as we kind of entered the supply chain ecosystem, we humbly recognized that there's a whole world of standards on the flip side that has already been established and in use for a really long time, GS1 being kind of the king of a lot of those. And so what we had the opportunity to do is obviously GS1 as the center of product identification today wants to continue to be able to offer that kind of value to their membership. And so this is a really important technology to explore. And it was being kind of incubated right around the time Digital Link came on the scene. And so what we actually did in this proof of concept was explore the various ways where we could connect decentralized identifiers and verifiable claims to existing GS1 standards through, for instance, the Digital Link. What that allowed us to do is demonstrate how new products can be onboarded more quickly, how claims about a product or maybe a smaller vendor who previously would have trouble rapidly building trust with a supply chain ecosystem could have claims and product information verified more rapidly. We have a really great demo video online and a write-up that explains the exact process. It was definitely a collaborative think tank effort between us and GS1. But we were able to show that linking things like Digital Link to digital identifiers allows for enhanced, again, visibility and expediency in managing new product introduction, as well as things like post-product consumption, recycling, recalls. There's a lot of opportunity, for instance, to manage or deal with circular economy type concepts if you have product identification that can persist past the point of consumption of the product, for instance.
Yeah, and for our listeners, digital link is just a standard that GS1 US came up with. Well, GS1, not GS1 US. Liz is rolling her eyes at me already. Sorry, but digital link is a standard that GS1 came up with a couple of years ago now. I want to say almost 4 years ago that it was ratified. And it just enables a web URI to be embedded into a 2D barcode. So that whether that's a QR code or a Digimark or data matrix and other 2D barcodes out there, it just enables a lot more flexibility, as Carol just said, whether it's recycling information, warranty information, and we're seeing people use it all the time for lots of different things.
I mean, it can be as simple as it could be as simple as a recipe. I mean, it can go to very important certification or something as simple as a recipe or, some marketing information.
Yeah. So, I was going to say, Liz, you guys bring up a really good point. The kinds of information that should be accessible about a product also should be accessible. That's dependent on who you are. If you're U.S. Customs, you should be privy to some of those enhanced certifications, or maybe if you're the end buyer. But if you're just perusing and you are considering buying a product, maybe that's not your purview. And you need enhanced ways of implementing that kind of product data using things like verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers so that you can provision access more granularly so that you can still use those same identifiers for all these different stakeholders. Because, of course, the plethora of stakeholders in supply chain is why these problems are really hard to solve.
Yeah. So when you were talking about verifiable credentials, and we're very aware of my knowledge of this, one of the things that we're working on heavily in the industry is the proposed rule for FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act. And I know this, it's a very basic record keeping regulation. However, these are things that folks are not really able to do right now. They have their own records, but it's going to be a new realm for them to share this information. You talked about circularity. You talked about onboarding. When we were talking before we started recording this, you talked about traceability. Can verifiable credentials also help with the traceability of food, of raw materials upstream and downstream through a supply chain?
Absolutely. And I would say that traceability is I think it is even in the title of our original RFPs with the government. Traceability is also what all the trade companies we work with, whether it's steel or e-commerce, are voicing. Because yes, the various regulators and customs organizations need reliable and enhanced visibility to do their jobs. The same thing on the business front. This technology can positively impact both compliance and risk and business efficiency and operations. And part of that, if you think about the various hosts of tiers in, say, an auto supplier network, there's very limited visibility into those kind of beyond the tier one. And knowing that as a business and having that kind of visibility allows you to take certain actions, make certain queries you wouldn't before. And I'll make that really tangible because I remember when we were prepping, I used this example. But back to steel and automotive, USMCA is obviously become a huge burden and for these companies as they kind of have to put together compliance systems that prove that a certain percentage of those raw materials were sourced in North America. But if you don't have sufficient visibility into your supplier network, how do you make sophisticated decisions about supplier switching, onshoring, nearshoring, ally shoring, or reshoring? All of these terms are becoming more and more popular, and you're seeing more articles about companies actually practicing them. And a lot of it is the fragility that we've seen in trade and supply chains since COVID has been highlighted. But also there's new trade agreements and regulations which are requiring certain origins of goods to be disclosed. And so as a company, if you want to optimize that tariff strategy or you want to take advantage of some of those benefits, you need visibility into your supply network to make those decisions. And using verifiable credentials gives you that. So this builds over time a digital data set that is the highest integrity data format that exists today. So running things like how many of my suppliers are in Asia versus North America, those queries become a lot more easy, as well as, where are the most anomalies or, fraudulent or just human error information being entered into our network. Those things become possible when you have data digitized in this format.
So you've talked a lot about different credentials, and then we talked about, folks leveraging paper and digitizing this all, but everyone's at a different technology stack, right? I mean, you have companies that have been doing it on paper, as you said, still some doing it on paper. And then you have others that are trying to move ahead, and we threw out the whole blockchain thing. And I love that you said, no, we don't need blockchain to actually do a lot of this work. But can you talk to us a little bit about the technologies that play well or that play best in this environment? Because I know a lot of folks are listening and saying to themselves, okay, this is great, but it's going to cost me, $10 million and this whole other group that I need to bring in to support this thing. But can you shed some light on the technology side?
For sure. So that's definitely our sweet spot. And I keep mentioning the standards. And the reason is nobody wants vendor lock. The government doesn't want it anymore. No government wants it anymore. The trade, commercial enterprise wants to move away from that. And so the value of building on open standards is that you can implement them yourself. You can easily switch across vendors. Of course, there's platforms and products like ours, which I'm definitely partial to, have made that implementation incredibly easy for our customers. However, the other thing that this does is it allows us to be interoperable with other vendors. Historically speaking, and including when blockchain came on the scene, which I'm saying in air quotes, the listeners won't be able to see, everyone was thinking, let's solve the data problems by getting on the same infrastructure. Well, that has not worked. And now everyone has tremendous investments in some kind of system, or they're going to make a decision about moving. In many cases, steel companies still operate on Excel for some of these certificates, and that's not unusual. And so we needed the solution for this has to be something that is open source, standardized, and available. And companies who use those standards need to prove interoperability. And so there's a couple other standards that we have been major authors of. One's the traceability vocabulary. All four that I've mentioned, we'll mention here, are housed at the World Wide Web Consortia, or the W3C, which I know GS1's very actively involved in as well. And the other is the traceability interoperability test suite. So our work with USCBP, it's actually required if you want to participate in the technical demonstrations and future piloting efforts and rollout that you pass these interoperability tests. And the reason for that is because they want to avoid vendor lock, and they want to ensure the standards were implemented such that they can receive data and make sense of it for their purposes. So we have a lot of literature and videos online where you can see us actually interoperating with competitors. If, for instance, our friends from MavenNet in Canada want to issue a mill test report from Canada, but our customer in America needs to receive it, and we can do that, and we've demonstrated that. So the purpose of I'll get to the tech stack piece, but the purpose of the standards is to insulate the entire industry from the tech stack decisions. We shouldn't care about what storage, or in some cases, folks may want to use a blockchain and anchor certain information to a ledger. And there are some narrow use cases where that expense and investment can be really valuable. But when we're talking about commodities where the margins may be really thin, the cryptography, decentralized identifiers, which applies very well understood cryptography, it is in that family of technologies, enables you to do that. And so if you're building on the standards, it shouldn't matter the tech stack. And there's a lot of work around interoperability profiles. You see at a variety of organizations such as the Decentralized Identity Foundation, who are doing just that. Looking at the different, I would say, kind of Lego block pieces of what kind of interactions need to be performed. In this case, it's issuing a credential about a product and being able to securely share that across the supply chain ecosystem. So as long as at the standards, kind of the pipes infrastructure level, the pre-competitive arena, then it won't matter what the other technologies you're using are. All of that said, I would say the most variety in the decentralized identifier space happens at the level of decentralized identifier methods. There's a host of them. You can find them online. They're built for different purposes. Some are built to improve scaling on a blockchain. Some are designed specifically to represent organization identity. Well, some are built to represent smart or IoT device identity. So there are some choices that need to be understood, but as long as you're conformant to these specifications, you can interact with this ecosystem without getting off Excel if you're using Transmute, because we have an Excel upload portion, or without getting off whatever your existing cloud or other infrastructure is.
So that actually brings me to my next question, is because what I was going to ask before you just said that was, how the heck do you get folks from something very manual, paper-based, or Excel, and kind of an old school way of thinking like me, to these new ways of thinking, of working, although it's not really new. It's everything that you're doing today, just in a digital way. How do you have that conversation to get them to make that leap, kind of taking regulations out of it, because we know they have to?
Yes. So there's, of course, the regulatory drivers, but also I cannot be discounted how COVID prompted so much investment in digitization. I mean, we're seeing kind of all the major logistics providers announce their big investments in digitization. And it's been a long time coming. I think those two things combined, plus just some of the skyrocketing costs of different parts of the supply chain ecosystem, are just forcing us to face this. But it's still just like any other technology innovation trajectory. You got to meet users where they are. So Transmute has always been a really pragmatic voice in the industry from that perspective. Our product is an API. It's a REST API. You like all of kind of the vanilla things you'd expect out of something like that. But even an API is language that a lot of these companies are not yet embracing. And so we do have a web app user interface that includes the ability to upload YAML or Excel files and other kinds of data, so that you can issue these credentials in a format you're comfortable with, and still get all of the benefits. That is the on-ramp. We expect that in the future, hopefully we're eliminating paper entirely. I think the last estimate I heard of the shipping industry on the Trade Talks podcast, I think it was, said that there was 28.5 billion paper documents a year. And it's only I think just the bills of lading are like an $11 billion cost to the industry, and there's less than 2% digitized. That might have been a couple years old data, but we have a long way to go. And we're not the only, at least here in the US, we're not the only ones still operating on paper. We do a lot of work in our R&D and our pipeline with manufacturers based in Mexico, and the same problems are on that side. Canada has long been funding similar research and development. Same thing there. And so, I think it's a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it's going to be a journey, but those use cases and meeting them where they are, but then they're going to continue to move forward. So eventually,
I would say one thing that's very compelling on the commercial value front is data minimization. So we're also, at the same time, we're talking about business identity and business efficiency and imports. The self-sovereign identity movement is still going on. We have GDPR in Europe. We have some of the California Data Privacy Acts. Privacy is a big part of the conversation. And part of that conversation is data minimization. How do I only take liability for the data that I need to serve my customers or to deal with the transaction at hand? The classic example of this in our space is the driver's license. When I order a margarita, why do you need to know my address or my age? Just, yes, I'm way above 21. So I think that when you apply that to business, what you have is these paper documents today being copied. Lots of opportunities for fraud, not just one, lots of opportunities for human error. And when you have an e-commerce space where we estimate over 40% of what's online is counterfeit, that the legitimacy of the data becomes so important. And you as a brand want to minimize your exposure to a lot of these risks. So with a verifiable credential, even if you upload it into our platform with an Excel file, once it's created, that mill test report or that commercial invoice can be selectively disclosed across the supply chain as many times as you need, without making a copy. There's no redundant data. And if it's tampered with, the cryptographic signature won't resolve. So that's evident. And so this is, I think, a really compelling and game-changing piece that doesn't really change their operations immediately, but then really minimizes their administrative costs while actually enhancing their own protection.
I'd say this is fascinating, and I'm so glad you brought up the example of the driver's license. As you were talking, I was thinking of that. I've heard that before, especially in these like zero knowledge proofs that, we're all talking about. You're talking about this cryptographically, protected information and digitizing. But it also brought me back to you saying, we have APIs, and sometimes people are like, they open arms, it's a warm blanket, and others it's like, they cringe an API because their business isn't there yet. I mean, I worked in IT for 25 plus years, selling solutions, to large, small companies and of all different sorts. But you start to realize very quickly that everybody's at a different stage. Technology is really cool for small startup companies to jump in with the latest and greatest and really take advantage of a market and leapfrog things. But then there's others that have been here for a really long time. There's still people running AS400s and mainframes within their retail business. And it's not easy to just, let's just webify that. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And I love that you've taken this approach of open standards, flexibility, right? And not having this vendor lock-in of solutions. I mean, it just shows you're, agile and flexible through this. I mean, we could spend a lot more time going through this. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot more time. So I'm going to start with one of our two wrap-up questions here. And Carol, I just can't thank you enough. I mean, you dropped a lot of knowledge on us in a very short amount of time with some great examples. So from a personal standpoint, we always ask our guests, what's your favorite piece of technology today? What's something that's like, this is my go-to, I love it?
Oh, I feel like that's such an easy one, right? Because I've been obsessed with identity since the beginning of my career. So decentralized identifiers, I can't imagine that my career will go much out of that scope. I think I'm obsessed with it. I think that it's the same technology that's going to enable things like hopefully mobile driver's licenses in the future. There's other companies working on more personhood type applications. And I think that from the B2B perspective, it is also still the most interesting to me, because I think business identity, product legitimacy are some of the, and really national identity is some of the biggest problems of our time. And I think of what it enables combined with verifiable credentials as I think of kind of like an allied data shield. Like, what do you do in 50 states? How do you create standardization across variety? GS1 is great at this. How do you create the ability to act in unison and retain individualism? You can't without these technologies. So I think it's my favorite. Easy answer.
Wow, that's awesome. Liz, I think we might be seeing Carol in like the next Jason Bourne movie, or
seriously,
one of these CIA.
Oh God, I hope not.
Seriously. Well, before we get to the next question, I'm going to actually answer it myself. So we usually ask like, what's blowing your mind? And coming into this podcast, I was, to be honest, it's daunting, right? You hear this terminology and it can be a little bit scary, but you've been able to break it down in a way that even I can understand with use cases that are applicable in a lot of different places. So thank you for that. But what is blowing your mind today, personal or within your work efforts? Like what, makes you really think, holy cow?
So I'm not even sure if this is a real term, but I think for me, what blows my mind is when I get to think 10 years forward when this technology is already in use. And as CEO at Transmute, I usually get to do that more when I'm talking to our board or investors. And those are where those questions come up. But when I think about that and go back to the market drivers for this, the fragility of our supply chains, policy that hasn't kept up, the position that we're in, I keep thinking of the new kinds of markets it creates and the new kinds of policy, policy considerations. So back to the USMCA example I mentioned, where you should be able to query a data set that lets you switch suppliers with more ease, to know that, okay, if I concentrate all of my suppliers, auto parts suppliers in Mexico, I can comply with these USMCA and get these facilitation benefits accordingly. But in a globalized world, what does that mean for supply chain resiliency? And what happens when a brand from China relocates to Mexico? How is that regulated? What happens in terms of the ethical labor practices and rules that have gone into a lot of our trade agreements? How can we create a fabric of trust that allows us to make some of those activities more visible? And what is that going to do to policy? If we reshore or ally shore everything, and that's in conflict with resilience, what does that mean? Or if the origin, if a brand origin is not physically located where the rest of the manufacturing is, I just think we get into some really interesting questions that we haven't had to face before, because it just wasn't, we weren't all connected in that way. So I think that's kind of what keeps me up at night and excited. I'm really excited about that future. I also think there's a future where this term, I'll just say supply chain arbitrage is probably not the right term, but financial markets already are based on supply chain and certain commodity assets. But when we have such fine-tuned and fine-grained data and of high integrity, what does that mean? And with things like machine learning and AI, these get better if the data is better. The actions and decisions we make are only as strong as the data it's based on. And I think we're headed into a future where we actually have sufficient data to make real impact and also hold folks accountable. I think of some of the climate impact initiatives. How can we tie this kind of impact to the legitimacy of our brands and products? And how can we also not block out some of the smaller mom and pop farms and things like that? How can they more rapidly integrate? And I think in 10 years that we'll be there.
Well, Carol, we can't thank you enough. I mean, I'm just super glad that a person like yourself with this passion and intelligence and fortitude to keep driving through this all is this involved. I just got so much out of today's conversation, and you just reminded me, I was looking last week for travel flights for personal family vacation, and I jumped on Google, and for the first time, it actually showed me the carbon, that would be used for the travel. And so when you were just explaining the efficiencies we'll get 10 years from now in supply chains, and it'll have a big impact on multiple levels. A couple of things I took away from today's call is being able to balance facilitation versus enforcement, right? And going through this, that was the whole 32 days at the port, could be a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on the scenario. And then just using that simple analogy of a verifiable credential is like the shipping container for the data. There was so much more that you dropped on us, and really thank you for the time today.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you for joining the Next Level Supply Chain with GS1 US. If you enjoyed today's show, you can subscribe to our feed or explore more great episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to share and follow us on social media. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.